8 of the top 10 ranked teams fell to unranked opponents this week, with a pair of Wildcats in Kentucky and Arizona joining the loss party. Nobody is safe.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Folks, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a 5 times per week national college hoop show, part, of course, of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat over 50 infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. Isaac, it has been an insane week of college basketball. It started on Tuesday with Purdue and Houston both losing, the top 2 teams in the country losing to unranked teams. It was the 8th time that had ever happened in the same day. The next day we saw Kansas and Tennessee fall. And then as we got into the weekend, Kentucky falls, Arizona falls, Illinois falls. We'll talk about those games, but ultimately the end result of this carnage of college basketball top 25 teams was this: 14 of the top 25 teams in college basketball, according to the AP poll, lost to unranked opponents. They didn't just lose, they lost to unranked opponents. That was, we're going to take a deep breath, numbers 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 17, 19, 21, 23, 25. Every one of those teams lost to an unranked team this week. The only 2 teams in the top 11 who did not lose were the Huskies of UConn and the Tar Heels of North Carolina. We thought that maybe things would slow down this weekend after a chaotic week on Tuesday and Wednesday in particular. They instead did not. We'll start here talking about Arizona and Kentucky. We'll get into some of the Big 12 madness with Houston and Oklahoma both losing a pair of games. We'll talk about Illinois losing to Maryland and a few other funny results from the weekend as well. But Isaac, let's start with Arizona and Kentucky, because these 2 teams both had opportunities to potentially move into the top 5 of the AP poll. I don't know for sure if either of them would have had they secured victories over Texas A&M and Washington State, respectively, but they did not. Kentucky falls in overtime to A&M. It was a very chaotic, very high-scoring matchup, a really fun one between those
until
2.
Overtime.
Yeah. Really fun game. Arizona falls to Washington State. It's kind of the second mystifying loss for them in conference play after they lost to Stanford. This one was only by 3 points, at least, compared to the 18-point loss they took to the Cardinal. But these 2 teams had opportunities, it feels like. And top 5 rankings, I'm not sure that it's like the most important thing in the world. Like, they're not kicking themselves for that specifically. But it was an opportunity to move up, to kind of put themselves into that number 1 seed conversation, top 5 conversation. And both teams failed to do so. What stood out to you about these losses for these teams?
Yeah, it's funny. I think the Kentucky one is more understandable, I think, just because it's at Texas A&M, as you said. And I know that Texas A&M has not done what we all thought they would do this season. Mm-hmm. But this was the good version of Wade Taylor the fourth in this game. I should say the phenomenal version of Wade Taylor the fourth. Tyrese Radford had a great game as well for Texas A&M. And for Kentucky, it was a very good, close back and forth game. Mm-hmm. Man, I thought Rob Dillingham was going to single-handedly spur them to victory. He comes in off the bench. Kentucky's down 3 straight possessions, 3 straight threes, Andy. I was going bonkers in my kitchen because I was laughing at the absurdity. But here's the freshman experience. A couple possessions later, that same guy winds up what should have been Kentucky just holding for the last shot. Mm-hmm. For some reason, decides to try to move the ball around a little bit, gets it to DJ Wagner. Kentucky, has a turnover, and then they have another chance to score and get it to overtime. Mm-hmm. And you and I were talking about this. We don't know if Coach Cal drew it up this way or if Dillingham was just being a freshman, but he chucks up a 3. They're down 2, and there's still 4 seconds left on the clock. Thankfully for the Cats, Reed Shepherd is an absolute dude, and he gets the offensive rebound, calmly and perfectly sinks 2 free throws. And Texas A&M still almost hit a buzzer beater to win in regulation. But then, Andy, for as wild and high scoring as the regulation was, Kentucky only gets 3 points in all of overtime, and nothing until Reed Shepherd got a free throw with like 30-something seconds left.
Yeah.
And I just think, we've talked about the maturity of Kentucky's freshmen, but they are still freshmen. You're going to have some of these moments.
Yeah, and I mean, the big issue for me is the size for Kentucky. Trey Mitchell had a quality game. He played well. Ugena Nyenso had double-digit rebounds coming off the bench, which was much needed. But Aaron Bradshaw, in particular, you talk about freshmen who aren't always going to make a contribution in every game. I mean, he played 6 minutes. He had 4 fouls in 6 minutes, did not score. And that was a huge factor for Kentucky, was not getting anything out of their starting power forward. And I think they got out-rebounded in this game only by 8, so it wasn't a huge rebounding advantage, but it was a factor for them to not be able to crash the glass as effectively as they wanted to. Bradshaw didn't have any impact on this game. The team as a whole shot under 62% from the free throw line. Like, those are the kind of things that you need to be able to do to get wins. Now, for Kentucky, I'm not overly concerned about this for them long term. Wilmington loss is certainly the more problematic thing on their current resume, but in terms of like it impacting their ability to get in the top 5, again, I'm confident Coach Cal doesn't care about that. I doubt it really matters to Kentucky. It does matter a bit for the SEC standings. Tennessee nearly lost their game against Georgia. That should have. They were down 11 in that game. I thought Georgia was going to pull off a victory. I thought Tennessee was going to take their second loss of the week. They managed to secure a victory. Meanwhile, Auburn, who is now a very strong contender at the top of the SEC, they absolutely blew out LSU, crushed them in the first half, and basically just coasted in the second half to a nice win. LSU's not great necessarily, but that's still a big win for Auburn. So for Kentucky, I'm a little bit more concerned about their ability to stay at the top of the SEC, but overall, a loss to A&M on the road is not something that really concerns me too much for them.
Exactly, which is why I said that game doesn't matter as much. But then you look at Arizona losing at Wazoo, and look, Washington State has been fine.
They're okay. Yeah, they're okay.
Yeah, but Arizona, if they're going to be the team that we think they can and should be, they cannot lose a game like this, Andy. And I know we talk about that freshman experience. Let's talk about the Caleb Love experience. 28 points, 8 boards, 3 assists, only 2 turnovers. You love to see it. But it took him 25 shots to get there, Andy. 5 of 13 from 3. But, I mean, at least he's out there taking the shots and getting some kind of statistical production. Andy, anybody else for the Wildcats you noticed that maybe had 0 statistical production?
Yeah, I saw this on Reddit, so I'm not going to take credit for calling it a cardio game, but Kylan Boswell for Arizona had what, again, was called a cardio game because he played 25 minutes, 0 points, 0 rebounds, 0 assists, 0 steals, and 0 blocks, basically just running up and down the floor for 25 minutes. He was only 0 of 5 from the field, too, so he's not taking a lot of shot attempts. He wasn't distributing the basketball. He wasn't doing anything. He was just
he did have one thing.
A turnover?
1 turnover. That's right.
And part of that is playing with Caleb Love. That's part of the experience, as you kind of alluded to. But Boswell has had some inconsistencies throughout the year. And obviously, Arizona has a quality backup guard in Jaden Bradley, and he played 27 minutes in this game. So it's not like Tommy Lloyd was unafraid to play him. But you got to start to figure out how this lineup's going to shake out if you have somebody who's not contributing the way that he wasn't. And even Umar Ballo in this game, I mean, he had 11 and 14, which looks fine in the box score, but he shot 4 of 11 from the field. He was 3 of 7 from the free throw line. Like they have a really, really good starting 5 when all 5 of these players are playing well. But there is some inconsistency issues with Boswell, with Ballo, obviously with Love. That's kind of part of the experience. Pella Larson wasn't great in this game either. And those inconsistencies do make me worried about this team. They're 3-2 in the Pac-12. I'm not really worried about their overall standing in the Pac-12. Oregon's 5-0. Certainly you don't want to see that gap continue to widen, but Arizona is still a better team than Oregon in my mind. And I think that will eventually bear itself out in the standings. But it's hard to not be a little bit concerned about Arizona right now. I mean, these losses to Stanford and Wazoo are not good. They're road losses. They seem to struggle in that environment. And Tommy Lloyd's got to figure out a way to get some more consistency from his starters, or maybe switch things up a little bit and give some more minutes to some of those guys coming off the bench, because these 2 losses stand out pretty significantly, especially when you compare them to the other top 10 teams in the country.
That's right. I was pleased to see the 15 bench points from Arizona and all 3 guys that played scoring at least something. I know we've looked at Arizona's bench before this season and been like, y'all ain't getting nothing out of that. So that is encouraging to me. Andy, between these 2 sets of cats that you talked about, overall, which one do you think is in better shape right now?
Like long term, like just overall, I'd say probably Kentucky. They have a much harder schedule. Obviously, the SEC is better than the Pac-12 this year. There's not any debate about that. The SEC is much deeper, but I think Kentucky's a better team. I think freshmen tend to develop throughout the year. This team's guard depth is so good that I think that they're going to end up being fine. I think, I'm a little worried about Justin Edwards at this point. It's hard not to be. Aaron Bradshaw, certainly. But the guard play we've seen from this team is so good. Whereas with Arizona, I think they're really good, but these two losses really stand out to me. And I think that there's some concern about their ability to be ready for March, especially without playing a lot of great teams in the Pac-12. So I think Kentucky's in a bit of a better spot, but both these teams are still not in bad spots after these losses. They're just not in as good a spots as they could have been.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, talking about bad losses, how much that Wilmington loss hurts Kentucky from a resume standpoint going forward. Andy, let's shift to the good grief, the Big 12 mess where Houston and Oklahoma both lost 2 conference games this week. Cause for concern for these 2 top 10 programs, or just a product of playing in the toughest league in America? We'll discuss. But first, the NFL playoffs just kicked off, and there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Heck, you could still get in on the Bills and Steelers action because they postponed that bad boy. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is really easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like same game parlays. They've got the new Explore tab, which can help you find bets. Or Andy, how about the Final Four odds, which are kind of grouping all together now? It's interesting to look at after a wild week. Purdue still leads the way at +170, but UConn, Houston, Arizona all tied for the second best odds at +250, and then Auburn and North Carolina right behind at +390. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, Andy, the Big 12. We love talking about this conference because it's so bonkers absurd all the time, and we're finally getting to that where we're just like every Saturday is just a war of straight attrition. What's interesting is that now, we've kind of seen Houston, Kansas, and Oklahoma be the top 3 teams from like a rankings perspective. Houston has now dropped 2 in a row at Iowa State. Okay, we had wondered about the Cyclones. They've proven to be legit. But then at TCU on Saturday. But those games were only by 4 points and by 1 point. Yes, I did not do subject-verb agreement properly there. Right? And Andy, ultimately, this is not all that wild to think about because as good as Houston is, road wins in any conference are hard to come by, but particularly in Big 12 play. So Andy, let's start there with the Cougars. What do you see that contributed to these back-to-back losses this week?
Yeah, Houston, it's just an inconsistent offense. They're a team that, because they play kind of possession style basketball, they're great defensively. It's very unlikely to see them get blown out. I just don't think that's going to happen much. So them having a 1 possession loss to TCU, a 2 possession loss to Iowa State, that doesn't really surprise me. I think they're going to keep themselves in the majority of games just because they have that length, that good coaching defensively. Like they're just set up to do well on that end of the floor, but they don't have quite the offensive playmakers, shot makers, bucket getters that they've had in the past. They don't have a Marcus Sasser. They don't have Jarris Walker, who's just an athletic freak who can go get points when you need him to. And they brought in LJ Cryer. LJ Cryer was great in the non-conference. He's been great at times in conference play, but he did not do well in either of these 2 games. He was a combined 4 of 23 from the field. He was a combined 2 of 13 from 3 in these 2 contests against Iowa State and TCU, who are both very good defensive teams. It's not like Houston struggling offensively was only on their end. It was, hats off to both the Cyclones and the Horned Frogs for playing good defense and finding ways to slow this team down. But between Cryer shooting 2 of 13 from 3, Jamal Shedd was 2 of 11 from 3, this team's outside shooting just wasn't there. And when you're a team that needs to be hyper efficient offensively in order to win games because you're not going to have as many possessions. Arizona can have a Caleb Love who takes 25 shots a game because they get a whole bunch of possessions every single game because of their style. That doesn't work at Houston. And when these guys aren't shooting threes well, it's a problem for them. And that's what we saw in these two games. Like you said, I'm not overly worried about Houston. I don't think that this is some like big gotcha moment of like, oh, they're not ready for the Big 12. Like they lost two close games to good teams. Would you have wanted to get one of them at least? Sure, of course. Are they still going to be in the top 5? No. Are they going to be in the top 10? I'm not sure. I haven't made my rankings yet, but if every other team around them didn't lose, they probably wouldn't be. But at this point, we'll see. But this is a growing experience for this team. I think it's going to help them down the line. It's going to help them as they get into the NCAA tournament. But at the end of the day, the things we knew were issues with this team are causing them to lose games. Right. And that's not going to change unless they can find a way to actively make that happen.
Yeah. And, with Houston, to your point about not being too concerned, they're still number 1 in the net. They're still number 1 at KenPom. But when you break down kind of the net stuff, they're 4-2 in quad 1 and 8-0 in quad 4. Lots on the polar opposites, literally 0 quad 2 results, Andy, and 2-0 in quad 3. So literally the middle of their resume is just devoid of anything, which is really interesting to me. And so we'll have to see what goes on with that. And, we just got to keep waiting on this resume to keep unfolding. They do have Texas Tech at home this week on Wednesday and UCF at home on Saturday. Obviously, Texas Tech is the more difficult of those two games, although they should win both this week. We'll have to see. Andy, let's move along in the Big 12 where Kansas takes care of Oklahoma quite well. Thank you very much. 78-66. Honestly, a great response by the Jayhawks after losing, speaking of UCF, down there. Jayhawk, close game at halftime. Jayhawks are up 1, pull away late. Another big time game from Hunter Dickinson, man. 24 and 14, 5 blocks to go along with it. But Andy, I think the key talking point for us, and I know we're talking more Oklahoma here because of the Houston and Oklahoma, but I think this has been such a big talking point for you and I, is the shooting guard position for Kansas, wherein you noticed that Bill Self replaced Elmarco Jackson with Johnny Furphy from Down Under. That's a terrible Australian accent, Andy. I beg of you to never let me do that again. Johnny Furphy replaces Elmarco Jackson in the starting lineup.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can stop you from doing that again. I'll try, but
no, you have to get inside my head and know what's about to happen and don't let it.
This was a much needed change, I think, for Kansas. And look, Furphy played 19 minutes, Jackson played 18. So it's not like there was this huge spread in playing time. But it was, I think, a transition that needed to be made just because of the way Jackson has not really been contributing to this team lately. Furphy had 7 points, 3 boards in this game. Jackson had 2 points on 1 of 1 shooting. Just wasn't much of a factor. Once again, I think the announcers noted when Jackson did score, it was like in the middle of the second half. And I believe it was his first point since they played Wichita State, which was like 2 or 3 games ago. Like they just weren't getting anything offensively out of Jackson. They've gotten nothing out of Nick Timberlake, the transfer from Towson, who we kind of expected to have a much bigger role for this team. And Furphy has been the biggest performer out of this group, and seeing him step into the starting lineup, I think is hopefully a sign of positive things to come for Bill Self's squad. But like you said, with Oklahoma, I mean, they've 13-1 start to the season. Everybody was excited. Porter Moser was kind of riding high. This team looked great, but we're not shocked that they're not winning every game in the Big 12. The Big 12 is really, really hard. Their losses are at TCU and at Kansas. I don't really have an issue with either of those losses. I think we note that TCU is, part of both of these conversations with Houston and Oklahoma. Perhaps later in the week, we can do more about TCU specifically, since they're involved in all these games, but not getting their own talking point here. But for Oklahoma, like 2 tough games, 2 tough teams, 2 tough losses, it doesn't really concern me long-term. I think there was not a super high likelihood they were going to remain a top 10 team when they kind of snuck into that conversation. But these losses don't make me feel like, they're going to drop 10 or 15 spots again with everybody around them losing. Most teams are not going to drop as much as people might think they will. But this to me doesn't say all that much good or bad about Oklahoma. It's just kind of what I would have expected to happen almost.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma, the good news for them is they did everything they needed to in non-con play to set themselves up to just like, you go 9-9 in Big 12 play and you're good. Their lone non-con loss being the North Carolina in Charlotte.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, you can take that. Andy, we got to quickly talk. A neutral site game. Okay. Elsewhere in the Big 12, Andy, Baylor moves to 3-0 with a 62-59 win over Cincinnati. Baylor, by the way, Andy, the number one team in the nation in three-point percentage right now. That's in the entirety of D1. Texas loses to West Virginia, excuse me. No, Virginia did not win, Isaac. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Andy, I swear to you on the love of everything holy, if Texas is in the AP top 25 today when it comes out Monday, I am going to lose my freaking mind. AP voters, do this right for once in your lives. There's that. Now, BYU, congrats, finally gets that first Big 12 win after a great start to the season. I know it's over UCF, but hey, let's not besmirch UCF after what they did to Kansas earlier this week.
Yeah, quickly on the Texas thing, West Virginia is probably the second worst loss you can take in the Big 12. Now it was
Oklahoma State. Would you say is the other?
Yeah, Oklahoma State's probably the other one. It was in Morgantown. It's a hard place to win, but for Texas, Max Asmus looked great. Dylan Dessou looked great. The rest of the team didn't show up for this one. I have a hard time seeing them being a top.
Yeah, it was 2-on-5. It was the wildest thing.
The fact that they kept it close against West Virginia 2-5 is pretty impressive. No, Texas, we'll see if they can rebound from this. But yeah, they shouldn't be anywhere near the top 25. Hopefully the voters will agree. Isaac, Illinois took a bad loss at home against Maryland, on Sunday afternoon. We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss that and a handful of other results from the weekend in our weekly six-pack. But first, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Jace Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of life, but can we talk for a minute about preparing for when those real life events happen? Because according to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. And I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if someone I loved was getting sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, there's Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This could happen to any one of us. So visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It has never been more important to be prepared than today. So go to jacemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. All right, Isaac, it is Monday. It is a six-pack, and it is crazy that we're talking about multiple top-ranked teams losing to unranked teams in a six-pack, but that is how often it happened over the last couple of days. We'll start with Maryland beating Illinois, taking down the 10th-ranked Illini, 76-67. Again, this game was at Illinois. And look, Illinois has held up without Terrence Shannon Jr. up to this point. They've managed to kind of survive. They lost to Purdue just by 5, but you kind of knew it was going to catch up to them eventually. TSJ was just too much of their offense, too much of the focal point for this program. Meanwhile, they finally suffer that loss that we kind of thought was coming. I wasn't expecting it against Maryland necessarily. This is not a team that has had some preseason expectations, some hype. They got some talented guys, Jameer Young and Julian Reese. We knew those were the 2 best players on this team, and they absolutely looked like it. They had 48 of Maryland's 76 points on Sunday, but enough to finally take down the Illini. We'll see how they can respond from this, what they can kind of do, because I still think even without Shannon, they're probably still a top 5, maybe top 4 team in the Big Ten. But whether Wisconsin can kind of stay at the top, of course, Purdue's going to be in that conversation. But this is the kind of game the Illini needed to escape and not lose, and they were unable to do so. Hats off to the Terrapins for taking off a big victory here.
Andy, Creighton survives beating St. John's 66-65. Trey Alexander sinks 2 free throws with 10 seconds left to secure this victory. And I don't mind saying that Coach Pitino was big mad after this thing was all said and done. St. John's, and understandably so, because the Johnnies were up 9 with 9.5 left, but Creighton uses a balanced scoring attack. All 8 starters, Andy. All 5 starters had 8 or more points in this thing, and we had a double-double but no siree, it was not Mr. Ryan Kalkbrenner. It's Baylor Shireman comes home with 17 points and 12 rebounds. Great for the Blue Jays to keep pace in Big East play. By the way, this evens their conference record with St. John's. They are 4-2. Both teams then behind Villanova at 4-1, UConn at 5-1 after their Sunday victory, and Seton Hall also at 5-1. Andy, good stuff in the Big East.
Moving over to the ACC, Wake Forest absolutely crushed Virginia. We made a joke about Virginia earlier. They got beat by 19 points. Hunter Salas, 21 points, 9 rebounds for Wake Forest. He has continued to be a menace for this team, looking like another ACC Player of the Year candidate. Steve Forbes loves getting his transfer guards and bringing them in and having this kind of success for Virginia. Again, a team that when they lose badly. This has happened to them multiple times. They have 5 losses. One of them is neutral. 4 of them are on the road. The margins of victories for the opposing teams in these losses for Virginia, 24, 23, 22, 16, and 19. My goodness, Tony Bennett's team has been getting worked in a handful of their games. They're 9-0 at home, taking care of business when they need to at home, but they're 0-4 on the road. And this is a team that's further and further away from being in that NCAA tournament conversation. Meanwhile, Wake Forest is now 4-1, second in the ACC, a tie with a handful of kind of unique teams. Duke, you'd expect to be there. NC State, okay, that's not surprising. Florida State, also in the conversation. Not exactly who you'd expect, but Wake Forest putting themselves in a position to be a quality at-large team with the way they've been playing as of late.
Andy, let's move to the Pac-12, where Colorado beats USC 68-58 in a battle of 2 teams who are not doing this season what we wanted them to do, albeit for Colorado, a lot of it has been injury concerns of late. Andy, we haven't talked about Isaiah Collier being out for USC. It's 4 to 6 weeks. Have we seen the last of him in a Trojan uniform? I don't know, and I hope not. Colorado was down in this game 37-24 at the half. Andy, that is kind of hard to believe here, but true. Comes back and outscores USC 44-21 in the second half. This is the second game for Colorado having both Cody Williams and Tristan Da Silva back. But despite that, they had lost at Cal midweek, so kind of trying to figure out who they are again. But here we go. We just talked about some nice balanced scoring a second ago. Well, we get that for Colorado as well. The starters getting 9, 12, 12, 13, and 15. But Andy, here's what's interesting. Leading the way was not Cody Williams, not Tristan Da Silva or Eddie Lampkin or KJ Simpson, but Javon Hadley. Great stuff from Colorado. If he can keep doing that, that's a great starting 5 for Tad Boyle's team.
Moving over to the Mountain West to close out the show with a pair of games from one of the more exciting conferences in college basketball, New Mexico. The Pit is a tough place to play, and San Diego State found that out the hard way. They got destroyed by New Mexico, 88-70, a huge win for the Lobos, who'd kind of been there's the top 5 in the Mountain West, and they had been kind of the distant 5th team, and now they've kind of pushed themselves back further into that conversation with an 18-point win here. And look, here's the deal. San Diego State was up 12 with 5 minutes left in the first half. They were up 35-23. New Mexico went on a 17-2 run to close the half. But for the rest of the game, at that point when it was 35-23, New Mexico outscored them by 30 in the final 25 minutes, 65-35. Really nice game from the Lobos. It'll be interesting to see if these teams playing each other is going to help or hurt how they get perceived when we get into the Selection Sunday conversation. I think there's still 5 teams in this conference that deserve to be in that conversation. But if they keep beating each other up, it'll be interesting to see if that hurts or helps them when that selection committee takes a look at them in March.
Woof, Andy, sticking in the Mountain West Conference, Utah State gets an improbable victory over UNLV 87-86. Now, I don't say that in a vacuum because, just all things considered, of course, Utah State should beat UNLV. Improbable because of the situation in which it happened. But first, 15 straight wins for the Aggies. They're now 16-1 on the year. Andy, great stuff. But here's why the improbability. Utah State is down 86-82, and I think there was 14 seconds left at this point. They get basically a 5-point play to win the game. How does that happen, you ask? Let me tell you. They make a three while UNLV gets called for a foul in the rebounding action, jockeying for position under the basket. The call is controversial. Fine, whatever. Kind of maybe looked like the Utah State player caused the contact, but a foul's called. Make the free throws. Ball game. They get out of town 87-86. So Utah State, you talk about how wild the Mountain West is. They're now 4-0 with Boise State just behind them at 3-0. Andy, going to be really interesting to see how this conference continues to play out. All right, folks, a great Monday of college basketball. As we record this, we have not yet seen the new AP poll. We haven't yet done our own rankings. So, Andy, I'm super excited to catch up on all of that tomorrow because this is going to be bonkers. I'm telling you that right now. And there's a handful of teams that we're really interested to talk about. They're doing good work in their conference games right now, thinking about Oregon being undefeated, Alabama being undefeated. So we're going to have to treat some of that as well. Folks, we want to thank you so much for joining us, getting back into the action today. If you're not part of our Discord yet, the link for that's in the show notes. We'd love to have you come chat college basketball with us all week long. If you would, vote for us on the Sports Podcast Awards, where we are up for Best Basketball Podcast. The link for that is also in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, and we'd love to hear your comments. Smash the like button if you're watching on YouTube. As always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats, even though they both lost yesterday on Saturday. And until tomorrow, peace.